By the time I was 40, I was a seasoned Christian. I'd matured in the ways that I approached my commitment to Christ. I was still strong, but I was strong because I had acquired a level of wisdom and knowledge that made me strong. I'd come to believe that by being strong, it was not just about gifts and talents, as much as it was about spiritual understanding. An understanding that came by reading all the books and listening to all the sermons and listening to all the Christian music and the videos. But now that I am somewhat over 60, and in a way that I perhaps have never experienced before, I am coming to understand the truth that it's not in the gifts and the talents. It's not those things that make me strong. And they are tools. They are tools that help me do the work that God calls me to do. But in themselves, they do not make me strong. I'm coming to understand also that all the acquired knowledge that I've gained from books, from sermons, from videos and so forth, and even from my friends, is not in itself enough to make me strong. These things encourage me in my walk with God. They turn my eyes in the direction that I should be going as a follower of Christ. But at the end of the day, learning about somebody else's experience of God is not the same as having my own experiences of God. What I believe the Holy Spirit is teaching me is the truth that Paul talks about in our reading this morning, that it is in my weakness that I am made strong. It's not in gifts and talents. It's not in knowing what God has done for other people. What makes me strong is seeing what God is doing in my life, in spite of my own weaknesses and my failings, along with all those other things that come against me in this life. At this point, I'd like to share, if I can, a part of my personal walk over the last few months. Or in fact, I'll go back a little bit further than that. After I've done that, I'd like to take a look at what Paul is talking about when he talks about weaknesses making him strong. A couple of months ago, I felt like I was revisiting a place that I was at nearly 4 years ago. Not a physical place, but a spiritual place. When I was commissioned into the role of pastor in Karoi and Pomona congregations, it was September the 1st, 2017. On that night, for the first time, I was burdened with a very real sense of unworthiness. In my mind, I believe that God took me to a place where I was made aware of all those things that were holding me back. I felt an overwhelming sense of inadequacy. It's not really what you want to be hit with when you've just taken on a new role. In some ways, I felt a little bit like Moses. If you remember how Moses was approached, I could see the burning bush, if you like, and I even felt sure that I had heard the call of God coming out of that bush. But as I looked at what God was showing me about myself and my weaknesses, I just wanted to say to God, God, I think you have made a dreadful mistake. But you see, God doesn't make mistakes. We do, but God doesn't make mistakes. In the weeks that followed, my sense of unworthiness and inadequacy, it didn't really diminish in those weeks. But instead, they were used as a very powerful tool in God's hands to remind me that out of the depths of my unworthiness, God will work his wonders, and there will be absolutely no doubt in my mind that it is God doing the work. Paul says that Jesus said to him, this is Paul speaking, Jesus said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. Now, some months ago I had a similar experience. This time I felt my Christian life was waning You ever have that experience? You know, you've been a Christian for years, and yet you arrive at a point where you feel as though it's not what it used to be. You feel a little bit out of touch with God. This happened to me a few months ago. And what I felt desperate really to get back to the way I felt. Remember I said when I was 20 how I was really on fire for the Lord and everything. I felt strong. I felt I had the gifts and the talents that God was giving me. I had this strong burden a few months ago in my walk with God that I wanted to get back in my life to a place that was similar to that. My life in those days revolved almost 100% around the person of Jesus. And in many ways, my life in all the years since have also revolved around the person of Jesus. But a few months ago, I felt that I felt challenged in the spirit to acknowledge that I had allowed other distractions to take central focus off Christ. And I was left with this sense that in my weakness, I had departed from the source of my spiritual strength. The yearning that I felt in my spirit to be restored with Christ and realign my life to place Christ at the centre brought me back to a place where I experienced the mighty grace of God all over again. Again, I had been made aware of my weaknesses, my unworthiness, my inadequacies. But through that, I am learning that the power of Christ rests upon me when I am weak. And I go to Him for my strength. You know, it's a most humbling experience, if you like, to be shown your weaknesses. You know, weaknesses are manifested in many ways. Our weaknesses can present as personality traits, if you like, that hold us back. An argumentative spirit, perhaps, or an inability to control our temper, perhaps. A timidness or a fear of ridicule of our Christian faith can be a personality trait that we live with, but it holds us back. We would see it as a weakness. It may be a weakness for sinful behaviours such as lust or a controlling desire to be rich. It may be pride. Our weaknesses can also be physical, health limitations that make it difficult for us to answer the call of God on our life. You see, I didn't want to see my weaknesses. I wanted God to show me my strengths. I wanted God to show me all the things that I was good at so that I could serve Him with an element of confidence. I figured I was probably good at many things that I didn't even know I was good at yet. I wanted God to show me those things, to strengthen my witness, and by developing the things that I was good at. Instead, twice now in the last 3.5 years, God has taken me aside and He's turned my attention to my weaknesses. Instead of powering on in the confidence of my own strengths, God led me to the place of humility and a place of repentance. When God exposes all of our weaknesses, and then you gaze upon those weaknesses from a new vantage point, He says to you, you know, in spite of all that you see about yourself, in spite of all the bad habits that I have just shown you, in spite of the sin that would separate us, in spite of your pride and your cowardice, I love you more than you will know. He says, I will use you to do things that you didn't think were possible. When I am weak, then I am strong, because I put my trust in Him. The Apostle Paul wrote these words when he was struggling with an issue that he described as a thorn in the flesh. Now, we don't know exactly what was troubling him, but the severity of this affliction was obviously so bad that he really weakened him. He asked God 3 times, he says, to take it away. But as we saw before, God's reply was simply, "My grace is sufficient for you." Paul took this as God's way of keeping him humble, of keeping him dependent on God. But what does Paul specifically mean when he talks about being made strong in his weaknesses? Well, if you go to verse 10 of the reading that we took, the last verse of the reading that we took this morning, Paul mentions 4 things by name which he has in mind. He mentions insults, he mentions hardships, persecutions, and depending on the version of the Bible you read, calamities, or I think the version we took this morning was difficulties. So you can see that what Paul has in mind here is not just personality weaknesses, and it's not sin. He's not talking about a kind of behaviour, like we might say that, he has a weakness for lust, or she has a weakness for overeating. Paul's not talking about bad choices that we make. He's not saying that the power of Christ is perfected in my bad choices, or that I will be all the more gladly boasting of my bad choices. Weaknesses here, as he speaks about them, are not imperfect behaviours. They are circumstances and situations that make us look weak or feel weak. Things that we would probably get rid of if we had the strength, but they are beyond our control. He mentions persecutions and insults and these sorts of things. Paul indicates that the affliction that he was suffering in what he called the thorn in the flesh was the work of the messenger from Satan. How do we take that? Do we assume then that all the things that cause our weaknesses are the work of Satan? Well, I don't think these verses prove that. But certainly we can assume that certain things are. We can also see, though, that Satan is not the only one at work here. We know this because Paul describes the purpose of the thorn as being to humble him, to guard against pride. Satan doesn't want us to be humble. If it was solely Satan at work, he would be building up Paul's pride. Paul had seen so many wonderful revelations, that things that he calls visions, that it would be easy for him to be pushed into the sin of pride. He's very specific about not wanting to go that way. Satan wanted to make Paul miserable and turn him away from the faith and his ministry and the value of the visions that he had seen. But God wanted to make Paul humble and turn him away from the sin of pride. So God appointed the thorn of Satan for the work of salvation. So what started out to be a work of Satan was turned into a tool that God would use for his glory. God was taking the affliction and he was using it as a way of keeping Paul on the straight and narrow. Simply saying to Paul, you must keep the thorn. I'm not going to take it away. You must keep the thorn. But remember, my grace is sufficient for you. God didn't take the thorn away. Does that ring true to any of us? Does God still use these things that make us weak to help to make us strong? I believe he does. God's purpose in our weaknesses is to glorify the Son. The grace and the power of the Son. But not necessarily by getting rid of all of our weaknesses, but by giving strength to endure and remembering that his grace is sufficient for us. Very powerful lesson that we need to learn. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying, and don't think that I'm saying that God will never develop our strengths. Of course he will. And don't ever think that we should be cowering in fear of our weaknesses. God never leads us into a work that we are not capable of completing. God's grace is sufficient for everything that God would call us to do. And he has given us our strengths to glorify him also. So we have weaknesses, we have strengths. All can be used by God. From time to time, I believe that he will make us aware of our weaknesses, to humble us. But he expects us to hone our gifts and our talents and our strengths, and to use them in our life of witness for his glory. You see, if we only ever give to God that which we can do in our own strength, we will never fully understand the strength that comes from a total dependence on God when we are at our weakest. The deepest need that you and I have in weakness and in adversity is not quick relief. We might think that's the greatest need we have, to be relieved of whatever it is that is burdening us. That's not our greatest need. Our greatest need is to have a well-grounded confidence that what is happening to us is part of God's great purpose to demonstrate his sufficiency in all the situations that we will face in this life. It is in my weakness that I am strong. This morning I would urge each one of us to pray that God will take our weaknesses and he will turn them into strengths. That God will be glorified all the more as we lean on him for our strength. Amen.